Well, welcome to the session. So this is day two for you in this conference. So you've learned quite a few new things, I'm sure. I know there were a lot of discussions about AI and some of the changes that are affecting TechCom. So what I wanted to do was talk a bit about some of the changes that we've already been through as a community. I would argue that TechCom has been through about as many changes as just about any other function out there. And so I've been in this space for about 20 years. I've been with Zoomin for about two. And today I'm really talking to you more from a perspective of a former tech writer, a former tech comm manager, tech stack developer, standards participant, and just some of the things that we've seen, what we've learned from it, and how we can use that learning to maybe lower our stress level a little bit as we look at what it's going to take and when some of the new AI-driven changes are going to impact us. So this little hermit crab here in the middle, this was us in, around the year 2003 was when I started at Motorola. And at that point, we were almost all doing some kind of desktop publishing. There were, some people using DocBook already. There were some bigger companies that had larger custom implementations of either HTML or XML based, or even database-driven publishing was in place. But there really weren't that many companies doing the independence of content plus formatting plus from context, which is something that we basically all live and breathe today. And at that time, there were pressures, and these pressures exist today still, like product complexity. Like I was in the semiconductor business, our products went from like hundreds of thousands of transistors to literally billions of them. And the complexity of products has definitely been some point of scale that we've had to adapt to. And then, market windows are very competitive. So we have to be able to get documentation out oftentimes before the product is released, which is a change from the past. And of course, about localization, reuse is important in cost. And so what we came across was, we're going to have to be able to have both modular and what I'm calling programmable content. And I'll explain that in a minute. And then having our workflows aligned with whatever the DevOps is in place with your product development team. And content has to be machine readable, and it has to be multi-channel publishing from the get-go. PDF just isn't enough. So a lot of us went through major transitions, and so we had to make some major choices. Some of us went to turnkey vendors. These are the tools where you can author, manage your content, manage your metadata, and publish, and even display in some kind of web help portal, directly all in one turnkey vendor solution. There's also Docs as code. I mean, Git wasn't released until 2005, but people were still doing very similar things, just with other tools and other formats. And like I said, some of us built custom deployments and some of us went to XML. And one of the things that we learned from this was how painful it was to make those changes and to drive adoption and to get people to write in different ways. And we also learned that if we were using a turnkey vendor solution for everything, we were very dependent upon that vendor. And so as we made the transition into different ways of doing things, we wanted to avoid getting into those same traps. So vendor lock-in, then forced silos is something I'll explain in a little bit. But at the end of the day, we didn't want to just make a switch of tools. We didn't want to inherit the same problems with different tools. We really wanted to be more in control. We wanted to be able to swap out failing parts of our flow without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, essentially. And so what I'm encouraging people to do, and maybe you're already doing this, is to think about your tech stack, not necessarily in terms of the tools you're using today, but to really get a grasp and a good understanding of the different stages of your workflow and the different services that support those stages. So when I draw a tech stack roadmap, I don't even put tool names in. at least at the beginning phase. So obviously we have to do some authoring, and around authoring, you'll need some sort of editor, and you're going to need translation, probably. You'll need some kind of review process. You'll have to edit and store metadata. And those are all authoring kinds of uh, services. And so by breaking your entire stack down this way, it makes it easy for you to see and make a note of where your system is falling down and where improvements may be needed. So when you think about AI, where do we want AI? Do we need it at the editing stage, or do we need it more at the viewer interface stage? And I think breaking it down this way and understanding where those services can be helpful and will help you just sort of better take control of your roadmap and of your fate, and not repeat some of the mistakes that we made in the past, getting too single vendored. Excuse me. All right. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about, in terms of the services that you need, and breaking down the authoring piece of it just a little bit. And this really comes from some experiences that I had at NXP and Freescale Semiconductor. I was driving the adoption of DITA in a new business unit, and there was a few people that were real holdouts, would not adopt no matter what I tried. We developed a graphical XML editor for DITA, so that the old way of doing things is similar to the new way of doing things. They were using unstructured FrameMaker, and we just had a hard time with a few people. And I learned something very valuable from this experience. So I sat down with this guy, we'll call him Joe, and said, Joe, why are you not, why are you giving us such a hard time? And he said, I haven't written a block guide in 5 years. And so a block guide is basically a self-contained document about a piece of a component that goes into a larger chip. So it basically becomes a chapter in a reference manual. And I said, well, Joe, you just published, 5 block guide updates, earlier this week. What do you mean you haven't written a block guide in 5 years? And he said, my job isn't to write documentation. My job is to design products. And so for that job, my real job, I have to supply the same information that's in documentation, but in a different, text-based format that goes right into the engineering design automation flow. So he pulled up a spreadsheet, and a very detailed spreadsheet, and he went to a tab and said, you see these 2 buttons here? These are macros I built. This one generates FrameMaker files in MIF format, which is basically SGML. And this button generates the RTL I need, which is my real job. So it would have been silly to force Joe to author content directly in DITA, but I was able to work with him very easily to just change that macro that he had built, so that instead of generating SGML from MIF, he was able to generate DITA that would flow directly into our workflow. So the reason this is important, the reason I bring it up, is that when you think about your tech stack, you have to create a place for innovation to prosper. And where I was focused was where this purple arrow here is, which is I'm trying to get the standard information, the standard data, the standard format that works plug and play with all the off-the-shelf tools that I already have in place, whether commercial or open source or otherwise. And at the time, I was a member of the DITA technical committee, and I was a bit of a moral quandary, right? So we needed a way to meet our business needs, but the standard wasn't fully meeting them. So I became a trader, and basically opened up a way to customize DITA within our backend organization. And I justify this because I believe there is a time and a place for these kinds of customizations, as long as you have the capability and the workflow to normalize those customizations into the standard when it matters. So the question is, where does it matter? And so the silver device down here pictured is a timing gun or a timing light. And so in the old days, an internal combustion engine has air, fuel, and spark, and those three things have to be aligned in order for the engine to run well. And so the way you would adjust the timing, the electronic ignition, was you would stick this device on one of the spark plug wires, and every time that spark plug wire, the engine needed to be in a specific configuration. And so there was like this little line right by the water pump, and then another line on the block. And so the engine's spinning at something like 700 RPM, so you can't see it. But with that timing light, it works kind of like a strobe, so it kind of fires every time that spark plug fires. And it's at that precise moment that it really matters where those two lines are. So as it goes around the circle, 359 degrees, we don't really care where it is, as long as in that 1 degree of rotation, those two things line up perfectly. So I apply this to our quandary in that I'm more than happy to allow people to come up with better ways of doing things. You don't have to write things by hand if you can build a spreadsheet with a macro to generate it automatically. In fact, I think that's something we should be encouraging more of. But where it matters are the transactions and the transfers. Like as soon as you need to share that content with somebody else or some other system, that's when it needs to be brought back to the standard. And there's a few places and a few times that I've seen this. I've seen this one fairly recently, where people are putting like parametric notations inside of standards, or so this is a markup example on the left, right? And so something similar to this came into Zoomin, and we support Markdown. And I received this file, and I said, well, yeah, we absolutely support Markdown, but this parameter you have here is going to be expressed as a literal, because there's nothing on our side that will resolve that. We can, if you want to provide the libraries you're using to resolve those, we can install those too, but it might make more sense for you to maintain control and ownership over those, so that you can handle it in your own proprietary ways, right? And so I did customize Dida. I'll show you what that looked like just a little bit. But people will say, well, Dida has built-in ways for doing parametric data, conditional text, variables, those kinds of things. And the answer is, yeah, sure, it does, but it does it in a different way than the engineering teams were used to. So if you look at the notation on the left, of just having the $ and basically a value inside of the curly brackets, that's the way this engineer I was talking about, Joe, was doing his parameters inside his RTL. So it didn't make too much sense for me to make him come up with two different ways of expressing this logic. So we came up with another way of doing it, right? So I've seen other customers do this as well. So you'll notice like this attribute conditions. It's not a Dida attribute. It's not a other prop specialization. It's simply an extension to the DTD that was put in place. And then obviously the notation around using the $ and the curly brackets. It's not supported by Dida. But by enabling these engineers to do these kinds of things, helped minimize the friction of, first of all, getting adoption. It also made them a lot more accurate, because it was easy to use the exact same parameters, meaning the likelihood of getting parameter drift was much lower, right? So like I said, in order to enable that, you also have to address it. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but when you do provide a place for customization and for innovation within your workflow, make sure that you have a very clear process and map of how those things are resolved. So I mentioned a block guide earlier that Joe was creating. So Joe's block guide is used in 3 different devices based on different parameters. It has to have different feature sets, etc. So we basically had to, process the content in a way that we get standard outputs. And then from there, the job wasn't even really done either, right? But in terms of documentation, that's what we needed. Okay, so let's talk about unintended consequence. When you make changes to one place in your tool set, there will be impacts in other places, right? And so what happens is if you allow people to use the right tool for the job, let's say like a Dox's code flow, which makes absolute sense for a lot of applications, because of the way that standard, typically rolled out, it comes with some sort of markdown format or text-based format, and then it comes with some sort of processing library, and then it comes with a static site generator, and all that content within that flow is very happy. Everybody loves it. But most companies aren't so simple that you simply have one kind of format or one kind of content flow within your organization. So at that point, you have other things, maybe a different Dox's code flow. Maybe you've got one using Sphinx and then one using like Pelican or some other approach of doing that. So now you have 2 silos, and then you have some people writing in a content management system. So there's sort of another silo. Then you've got other kinds of content, and then you walk through all the different places where you have content, and then the complexity. You've solved for authoring, right? Your authors are using the right tool for the job. It's quality content. It's great, but now your complexity is moved over to your end user. Right, so now your end user has to go on a bit of an Easter egg hunt each time they're looking for content. They have to decide, where might somebody have put this content. And so there's a couple ways of dealing with that complexity. One is to simply think about this as a problem to fix with search, doing some kind of unified search. And then the other way of doing it is through a CDP. So Zoomin is a CDP, so just full disclosure there. And there's others, right? And basically what we do is solve for this problem by essentially importing or indexing for some kinds of content. All of the different sources of information that's potentially useful for enabling product usage, right? So this is one flow that we did in the semiconductor business, just showing how many different kinds of formats there actually were. And in this case, we were generating two data. This isn't not necessary to the flow, right? It can be any format that can be imported by the CDP, right? So then the content comes over, and no matter how it was styled or organized, when it comes together under a single umbrella, it now looks, nice and neat, and things are indexed and organized and much more findable and usable. And I'll pause for questions here in a minute. But to go along with your tool stack ecosystem and your breaking out by the different services and working on them, swapping out failing systems, also have in mind like more of a maturity map around the your strategy and how you use the success that you made the last quarter to build in more success this quarter, and then you can stand on the success of this quarter to build the next quarter, and so on and so on. And so this is a maturity map that I put together that's pretty general, and I think works in a lot of different use cases. So that'll be available in the deck for later. But the general idea is that you want to understand where you are today and where you're trying to go. Right? And then be able to articulate the impact that those achievements are going to have, or achieving that particular level will have, and then what kind of investment that it will take. And so this this really helps with your leadership when you're trying to get funding or support for different tools or processes or changes or headcount, because it does show a long-term vision and a commitment to further leverage the investments that were made in the past in order to keep going. Now I want to talk, so in my bio, I talk about cross-functional experiences, right, and cross-disciplinary. Here's one place where I would encourage everybody to be more familiar, and that's in your supply chain operations. If you talk to somebody in supply chain about your company and the things that go on in your company, they're going to have a completely different perspective of what your company is, what they do, uh, what the purpose of the business is, because they just see it from such a very, very different perspective. Um, when I was doing my Six Sigma and lean manufacturing training that I was using just as a sort of a background whenever doing change management in tech docs, the training was completely filled with supply chain people. They're the only people who really take those kinds of training, apparently. So I learned a lot about what they're doing. And there's some really, really interesting things, especially around AI when it comes to supply chain. And one of the things that is really hot right now is supply chain resiliency. All the pandemic and trade wars and conflicts have put a lot of stress on supply chains. So resiliency is the name of the game these days. And one of the concepts that you'll hear very often is around not being dependent on a single supplier, right? So supplier redundancy is key to supply chain. And I think that concept resonates with us as well, right? When I had the circles showing all the different services that are required for the different stages of documentation delivery, if you're dependent on a single vendor for any of those items, I think that's a bit of a risk. Now, that's not to say that you can't choose to have, a single supplier do all of your services. That works very well for a lot of applications. But even in those cases, making sure that there's some kind of plan in place for in case, you go into a merger and somebody takes that tool away from you, or in case, my very first CCMS is no longer in business, right? So there's no support for it. So it's that mindset not only is the right thing to do for the business in terms of providing that level of resiliency, but also if you're anything like me, it can help lower your blood pressure just a little bit, knowing that there is a plan. There is a plan B, there's an escape plan. And no matter what happens, the forethought that you put in building your tech stack will allow your operations to prosper for a long time to come. So in short, some principles to build by, right? So building a view of your content services, not your tools. Yeah, at some point, you do want to go in and, write the names of the tools that are in all those different places. But it's not the tools you're buying, it's the outcome of those tools that you're buying. And it's not the tools that you're integrating, it's the services that they provide that you're integrating. And then in terms of the formats that flow through it, I would say just try not to be overly dogmatic about the choices you make. I was very much born in the fires of DITA, and I will probably have DITA somewhere on my epitaph. But along the way, if there's a need that we have, and there's a better way of solving that problem, I'm gonna do the right thing, right? And the other thing about that is nobody's gonna kick you out of the club if you decide not to use a static site generator, right? if you're using something like a Docs code approach and the markdown format's working great for you, the use of Git, a dit is, oh my gosh, of Git is working great for you, but you decide not to use the recommended static site generator, and instead you want to publish to a CDP so your content is part of your overall information set, nobody's going to take your membership card away from Docs code. You'll be okay. And then, of course, planning with interchangeable parts in mind. And one thing that happens in conferences like this, we get all fired up, we get jazzed, and then we go home and sit, or not home, but we go to work the next day and you sit in our cube or in our office, home office, and then we get a little bit of depression, right? Because you just sit there and you think, well, I don't know how to get there, right? I saw these really great things, I'm excited, but I don't even know the first step to do. And so this is the last story I'm going to tell you, I promise. In college, I worked in retail, and it was a town right outside of Austin, and I didn't really know it very well. And a guy called, asked me how to get to the shop, and I gave him the address. I was like, this is where we are, and he wasn't familiar with the area either, so he gave me his address. And this is like the late 90s, so we didn't have Google Maps on our phone, or there was no navigation systems. So I handed the phone to my boss and said, hey, this guy's having trouble finding us, can you tell him how to get here? My boss is talking to him for a second, and he gets frustrated and says, you know what, I just realized you can't get here from there. And the guy said, okay, thanks anyway, and hangs up. And I'm scratching my head, and the guy calls back, and I pick it up, and he said, what does he mean I can't get there from here? And like, I don't know why he was being so Jonathan Swift today, but do you know where the Walgreens is? So Walgreens is like a pharmacy store. There's a lot of them in the US, a lot of them in Texas. Like, do you know how to get to the Walgreens that's right by the highway next to exit 251? And he said, yes, yeah, I know how to get there. I said, great, get there, go across the highway, turn north, we're right there on your right. And there's a couple of things I learned from that I think are relevant to this discussion and being part of conference culture. Number one, that was my first completed project as a solution architect, right? That's what we do. We work with customers, we understand the solutions that we have to offer. We learn to work to understand everything that's going on with your situation, and then provide that linkage between the two. And then the other thing is, for a brief moment, this guy accepted the fact that there's no way to get here from there. And that makes me sad, right? There's a lot of unhealthy beliefs and ways that people get in, limit their beliefs and limit their capabilities. So I would just say, coming out of this, if you're seeing technology, if you're seeing ideas that you want to implement, more than likely there's somebody out there that can get you at least the Walgreens, and then you can get there, the rest of the way there. So my contact information will be provided somehow, I'm sure. And if you're having issues managing multiple silos, if you're having issues with, I like to talk shop about just about anything. So don't be a stranger. Let's connect and make this world a better place, one documentation system at a time. So in quick summary, just know where you are, know where you want to go. Embrace innovation, but do it responsibly. See your stack as services, right? And don't be afraid to be yourself. Bring your curiosity to all these problems. You're not just a tech writer. You're not just a tech docs manager. You're probably a musician or an artist or a soccer player or a mechanic or a welder. All the things that make you give you a unique fingerprint in this world, and will be able to provide aspects and perspectives that nobody else on earth has. So don't be afraid to draw from other experiences and apply them in ways that don't seem to make sense. Because like Albert Einstein says, you can't solve a problem with the same mind that created it. So, and enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you very much.
Would anyone like to ask questions? You can type the questions in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. Okay, Sarah is raising her hand.
Hi. So I'm trying to understand, like, so we basically want to make sure we have interchangeable parts and kind of maybe future-proof ourselves, right?
Yeah.
So that when something changes, we're not like caught unable to adapt. So I'm trying to figure out how to do that. Like so, for example, we author in Wiki, but we can export to XML. Would that be like our entrance into the minute we have to move off of this Wiki or into another system? XML could help us then to bring into someplace else. Is that the kind of thing we're looking at?
That's a perfect example. That's a perfect example. And so I used to be rather hated by CCMS vendors because I would talk about these kinds of things, and since I had been through so many CCMSs in my life, I found that getting out of them was rather difficult, right? Because you build in so much of your business logic inside of their custom way of doing things, and so their fields, their metadata. They even manage links, a lot of them, right? But since that time, like all the major CCMSs I'm aware of now have much better like export capabilities, and they also have APIs, right? So, and I know this for a fact because a lot of them publish to Zoomin, right? And so I'm able to see that we've maintained the integrity of the metadata and linking and those kinds of things. But I think you're right. Having an XML export from your wiki is definitely one way of protecting that very valuable business asset, which is your content, from the the possible whims of different vendors. So yeah, that's a good example.
Great, thanks a lot.
If anyone else has a question, you can raise your hand and unmute.
And along those same lines, as Sarah was asking, is like, why now? Why is this a relevant conversation to be having? And I'm not going to make this another session about AI. I'm sure there's enough of those. But it is going to change the game, right? There are going to be new winners and losers based on how quickly different vendors adopt AI enabled services. And that's going to have more people looking at their stack saying, I use this tool, but it's not in a leadership position here anymore. And that's going to have you reevaluating more parts of your tech stack, and it makes it even more important to be thinking about these as services and not tools.
Okay, Seth, thank you very much. Are you going to be in the lounge later?
I'm not sure yet. I'm just about to start my day here.
Okay. Thank you very much. And your contact information is in the chat, seth.park@zoominsoftware.com. And thank you very much. And I guess I'll close the session now.
Very good. Well, thank you all for your time. Have a great conference.